Claire had always dreamt of owning her own home. After years of moving from one rental to another, the opportunity had finally come. The house was perfect, an old Victorian-style property on the outskirts of town. With its tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and vintage charm, it seemed like something straight out of a storybook. It was everything Claire had ever wanted, and now it was hers. She stood on the porch, staring at the house as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warm light flickered against the faded wood of the front door, casting long shadows. Claire's excitement was palpable. She could already picture herself inside, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and starting fresh. This house was going to be the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Inside, the house felt even more grand than it looked from the outside. High ceilings, dark mahogany trim, and antique chandeliers decorated the hallway. Every room had its own character. The living room was spacious, with large windows that let in the last rays of the evening sun. The kitchen had an old-fashioned stove that looked as though it had been in the house for decades. It was perfect. As she explored each room, Claire felt a sense of excitement mixed with unease. The house was beautiful, but there was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. She didn't think much of it at the time. After all, she had just moved in, and the house had been vacant for months. It was normal for an old house to feel a little odd at first, right? Later that night, as Claire settled in, the quiet of the house seemed louder than usual. She had unpacked most of her boxes and made herself comfortable on the couch in the living room. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wood settling. It should have been peaceful, but the silence felt unnerving. That's when she heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like the wind blowing through the walls. But soon it grew clearer, a soft whispering sound, as if someone was talking just out of earshot. Claire froze. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words, but all she could hear was a soft murmur, too indistinct to understand. She stood up, walking cautiously toward the source of the sound. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls. They seemed to move with her, following her every step. The more she listened, the more unsettling it became. Claire paused, her breath caught in her throat. Was she imagining things? Maybe it was just the house settling. Old houses made strange noises all the time. But no, this felt different. The whispering wasn't random. It had a pattern, as though someone was deliberately trying to communicate with her. She approached the wall where the whispers seemed to originate, pressing her ear against it. The murmurs grew louder, more distinct. Claire's heart began to race. She pulled back quickly, her mind scrambling to find a logical explanation. It wasn't possible. There had to be a rational reason for the sound. But when she looked at the wall again, she noticed something strange. A small crack had appeared in the plaster, barely noticeable, but there it was, as though the wall had been disturbed in some way. Her pulse quickened. The whispers, the crack, it was all too much to ignore. There was something wrong with this house, something she didn't understand. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself that she was just tired. It had been a long day of moving and unpacking after all. She decided to head to bed, thinking that in the morning, everything would seem clearer. But sleep didn't come easily. All through the night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmur of whispers. They were there, just out of reach, always lingering in the background. The more she tried to ignore them, the louder they seemed to get, until they were no longer whispers, but clear, distinct words, too faint to understand but unmistakable in their intent. The next morning, Claire went about her usual routine, but the whispers remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Like something in the house was aware of her every move. It made her uneasy. She tried to focus on unpacking and getting settled, but she couldn't stop thinking about the strange noises that had kept her awake. That afternoon, Claire decided to explore the house further. The basement was the only place she hadn't ventured into yet. It was accessed by a narrow, wooden staircase that creaked as she descended. The air down there was cool and damp, and the smell of mildew filled her nostrils. But as she stepped further into the basement, she noticed something strange. The walls were covered in what appeared to be old, yellowed newspaper clippings. They were scattered all over, glued to the walls with random patches of brown tape. Curious, Claire walked closer, inspecting the papers. Most of them were too faded to read, but some were still legible. They seemed to be from a local newspaper, and the headlines were all eerily similar. Tragedy strikes at the Collins house, family found dead in the walls, and the disappearance of the Collins children. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Was this about the house? Was this the same family who had lived here? The more she read, the more she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. The whispers, the newspaper clippings, it was all connected. The house had a history, a dark history, and it wasn't going to let her forget it. The strange noises grew louder that night. The whispers echoed through the house, growing more insistent, more desperate. Claire couldn't take it any longer. She had to know what was happening, what was haunting this place, and why was it so fixated on her. That night, the air in the house felt colder than usual. The whispers had followed Claire into her dreams, a haunting chorus that danced around her in the shadows. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. For a moment, everything felt still, but the whispers, they were still there. It was as if they were right beside her, soft and almost too quiet to hear, but persistent. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from somewhere closer. She could almost feel it, like a presence brushing against her skin. Claire reached for the lamp on her nightstand, flicking the switch, but the room remained shrouded in darkness. Her heart raced as her eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of the eerie silence that had replaced the whispers. Just the house settling, she muttered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She knew deep down that this wasn't just the house. A soft tap. Claire froze. It came again, faint but distinct, like someone knocking at the door. But there was no one there. Her gaze shifted to the bedroom door, and for a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move beneath it. Her body tensed, every instinct screaming for her to stay still. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was standing just outside her door, watching her, waiting. The whispers began again, this time clearer than ever. A name echoed in her mind, repeated over and over. Isabella. Who was Isabella? Why did the name sound so familiar? The whispers seemed to grow louder, more urgent, as though the very walls of the house were alive, pressing in on her. With trembling hands, Claire reached for the door handle, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Why did the house seem so alive, so intent on communicating with her? She opened the door, peering into the dim hallway. The house was quiet once again, save for the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. It was empty, nothing. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Turning back into the room, she shut the door behind her, locking it. The sense of being watched didn't fade, though. If anything, it seemed stronger now, as if something was lurking just beyond her sight. The next morning, Claire felt more exhausted than ever. The whispers had kept her awake all night, and the name Isabella echoed in her mind like a ghost she couldn't shake. She needed answers. There had to be a reason for the strange events, and she was determined to find out what it was. After breakfast, Claire decided to visit the local library. If she could learn more about the house's history, maybe she could make sense of the whispers and the name. She gathered her things, leaving the house behind with a sense of unease creeping up her spine. The library was quiet, almost too quiet. Claire walked through the aisles of old books, her fingers brushing against the spines as she searched for anything related to her new home. As she turned a corner, a book caught her eye, The History of Colin's House. Secrets in the Walls. The title seemed to jump out at her. It was exactly what she was looking for. She pulled the book from the shelf and took a seat at a nearby table. As she flipped through the pages, her heart sank. The house had a dark past, one that had been buried for years. The book detailed the tragic history of the Collins family, who had once lived there. It had been a family of 4 parents, a son, and a daughter named Isabella. Isabella Collins had been a young girl when she mysteriously vanished without a trace. Her disappearance had never been solved, and the house had remained empty for years after. The whispers, Claire realized with a shiver, were connected to Isabella. But why? Why was her name haunting the house? As she read on, Claire discovered more unsettling details. The Collins family had been known for their wealth, but there had been rumors about the house. Rumors that it was cursed. Some believed that Isabella's disappearance was tied to something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The house was said to hold a terrible secret, one that had been locked away for years. Claire felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as she closed the book. The whispers had to be connected to Isabella's spirit, but what did she want? And why was Claire being chosen to hear her? With the book in her hands, Claire returned to the house, her mind racing with the chilling possibility that she wasn't alone, that the whispers weren't just a figment of her imagination. There was someone, still in the house, and they were trying to tell her something. As she stepped through the front door, the cold air hit her, and the whispers returned. This time they weren't faint, they were louder, more urgent. The sound filled the house, surrounding her. They were calling her name now, not in the distant murmur from the walls, but as though they were right next to her. Claire. Her name echoed in the empty rooms, and for the first time, she felt fear take root in her chest. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The house seemed to breathe, the very walls alive with energy. The whispers swirled around her like a storm, louder and faster, until they felt like a physical presence. Claire pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but they wouldn't stop. Isabella, they whispered again. Find me. Claire's heart raced as she turned toward the staircase. The house was beckoning her, pulling her deeper into its secrets. She had no choice now. She had to find out what had happened to Isabella. But in doing so, would she uncover the house's dark history? And would she be able to escape it once she did? Claire hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the stairs. The house was silent now, but the air around her felt thick with an unnatural weight. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, lingering in the walls, but now they seemed distant, like they were waiting for her to make a move. With each step she took, the house creaked and groaned, as if it were alive, shifting and breathing in time with her movements. The stairs seemed to stretch on forever, each one feeling heavier than the last. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and the quiet only made the tension worse. As she reached the top, the whispering grew louder. It was like a swarm of voices, all trying to speak at once, but Claire couldn't make out any words. She felt the sensation of being watched again, as though someone or something was standing just out of sight, waiting for her to reach the top. When she turned down the hallway, The air grew colder, and her breath misted in front of her. The house felt more oppressive now, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. She knew she had to find the source of the whispers, but part of her didn't want to. What if she found something that was better left hidden? As she walked down the hall, Claire's eyes fell on a door at the far end, half open, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. The whispers seemed to come from that room now, louder and clearer than ever. She swallowed hard, stepping forward, her legs shaking with each step. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and Claire stepped into the room. It was a small, dimly lit bedroom. The air was stale, as though no one had been in here for years. Dust covered the furniture, and the wallpaper was peeling off in places, revealing cracks in the walls. But what caught Claire's attention the most was the old, wooden crib in the corner of the room. It looked out of place, old-fashioned, almost antique, with chipped paint and a worn mattress. But it wasn't the crib itself that drew Claire's gaze. It was what was inside it, or what used to be. A faint outline of a figure was etched into the dust on the mattress, as if someone had been lying there, perhaps recently. The room was still and silent, but Claire could almost hear the soft rustling of sheets, as though someone were moving beneath them. "Isabella?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The name seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the whispers returned, louder now, swarming around her, filling the room. The words were clearer this time, and Claire could hear them in her mind as if they were being whispered directly into her ear. "Find me. Please, find me." Claire took a step forward, her heart racing. The room was cold, the temperature dropping with each breath she took. The whispers had changed, becoming more urgent, more desperate. She couldn't ignore them anymore. There was something in this room, something connected to the spirit that haunted the house. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might give her a clue. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and Claire felt a strange pull toward them, as if the very walls were beckoning her closer. On the far side of the room, near the window, Claire noticed a small old chest. It was covered in dust, the wood cracked and weathered by time. She walked over to it slowly, her fingers grazing the surface. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, and her breath quickened. With a deep breath, Claire opened the chest. Inside, there were old letters yellowed with age. They were tied together with a piece of string, and Claire could feel her heart racing as she untied them, her fingers trembling. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages. The letters were written by someone named Eleanor Collins, Isabella's mother. Claire's heart sank as she read the words, her mind racing to piece together the puzzle. "My dear Isabella, it's been so hard without you. Every room in this house reminds me of you, and the walls, they whisper your name, as if they want to bring you back. But I can't hear you, not like I used to. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, or if you're still here, somewhere in the walls. I've been trying to find you, Isabella. I've been searching the house, and every time I think I hear your voice, it leads me to another dead end. The whispers grow louder, and I can feel you near, but I can't see you. I don't know if I'm losing hope, or if I'm too afraid to believe. Please come back. Please. The house can't be this empty without you." The letter ended there, the words trailing off into a sorrowful silence. Claire's hands trembled as she put the letter down. Eleanor Collins had written these letters, desperate to find her daughter. But what had happened to Isabella? And why had the whispers followed her, as though they were tied to the walls themselves? As Claire stood there, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching out around her. The whispers began again, this time mixed with faint laughter. A soft, eerie giggle echoed through the room, and Claire spun around, her heart racing. Something was moving in the shadows. Figure. She could see it now, standing in the corner of the room. A small girl with dark hair and a pale face. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, staring directly at Claire. Isabella. Claire froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The girl's mouth opened, and the whispers poured out, louder than ever. "Find me." Claire's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to close in around her. The whispers were deafening now, filling her ears, pounding against her skull. She had to get out, but Isabella's gaze held her in place, like a vice grip around her heart. The last thing Claire saw before the darkness took over was the girl's outstretched hand, beckoning her forward. Claire blinked hard, trying to clear the image of Isabella from her mind. Her heart raced, and the air around her felt thick with an eerie presence. The girl's hollow eyes seemed to follow her, even though she was no longer in the room. Claire could feel the cold touch of fear creeping up her spine. She stumbled back, her hands shaking as she grabbed onto the edge of the crib for support. The whispers had stopped, but the silence in the room felt worse, like something was waiting, watching, just out of sight. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps, and she had to fight the overwhelming urge to run out of the house, to leave this place behind and never look back. But she couldn't. The whispers, the ghostly presence, Isabella. There was something here that Claire needed to understand. If she left now, she would never get the answers she so desperately needed. Taking a deep breath, Claire forced herself to calm down. She turned toward the door, the feeling of being watched still lingering in the air. With hesitant steps, she walked back into the hallway, her mind racing with the things she had just seen. What had happened to Isabella? Why had her spirit remained here, trapped in this house? Her feet carried her down the hallway without thinking. Her mind focused on the letters she had found in the chest. Eleanor Collins had written them, desperate for answers. Could the mother's search for her daughter have led to something even darker? Claire had to find out. The house seemed quieter now, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The whispers were gone, but Claire knew they weren't gone for good. She could still feel them, echoing in the back of her mind. There was more to this house than she had realized, more to Isabella's story. At the end of the hallway, Claire found a door that she hadn't noticed before. It was small, tucked away in the corner, almost hidden by the shadows. Her fingers brushed against the doorframe, and she felt an odd, familiar shiver run down her spine. This room was different. It had to be. She opened the door carefully, trying not to make a sound. Inside, the room was small and cramped, its air thick with dust. A single window allowed a little light to seep in, illuminating the faded wallpaper and a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. But it wasn't the room itself that caught Claire's attention. It was what was on the floor. There, in the center of the room, lay an old photograph. Claire knelt down slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and picked it up, her fingers trembling as she studied the image. It was a family portrait. Isabella was there, a young girl with dark eyes and an innocent smile. Beside her stood a woman. Eleanor, Claire guessed, tall and thin, her face marked by a deep sadness. The photograph had been taken years ago, but the faded colors and torn edges made it look even older, like it had been forgotten for a long time. But it wasn't just the photograph that made Claire's blood run cold. It was the writing on the back. "We will never leave you, Isabella. We are here always." Claire turned the photo over, her breath catching in her throat. It was as if the words had been written just for her, just for this moment. The whispers seemed to echo in her mind, a strange and haunting reminder that the house held more secrets than she could ever imagine. She placed the photograph down gently, feeling a chill sweep through the room. There was something else here, something that didn't belong, but Claire couldn't put her finger on it. The house felt alive, like it was watching her every move. Turning to leave the room, she heard a soft creak behind her, as if something or someone had just moved. Claire froze, her heart racing again. She slowly turned around, expecting to see nothing, but what she saw made her blood run cold. A shadow. It was standing in the doorway, just a silhouette against the dim light of the room. Claire couldn't see the figure clearly, but she could feel its presence, the oppressive weight of it in the room. The whispering began again, faint but growing louder with each passing second. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice, clear and unmistakable. "Find me. I am waiting." Claire backed away slowly, her legs shaking, but she couldn't look away from the shadow. It wasn't moving, but it felt as if it were drawing closer with every breath she took. The voice grew louder, more frantic, until it filled the room, pushing against her thoughts, blocking out everything else. "Find me." Suddenly, Claire snapped out of her trance. She spun around and fled, her feet pounding against the old wooden floors. She couldn't explain what she had seen or heard, but she couldn't stay in that room any longer. The shadow, the voice, it was too much. She ran down the hallway, her pulse racing. But as she passed the staircase, something made her stop. A soft sound, like the rustling of paper, came from the other side of the room. Claire turned, her eyes scanning the shadows. The whispering grew louder, as if it were calling to her again. The door at the far end of the hallway was open now, and Claire could see a faint light spilling from inside. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and walked toward it. When she entered the room, she found herself facing a desk. On top of it was an open journal, its pages yellowed with age. Claire approached slowly, her fingers brushing the cover. She had to know more. She needed to understand what was happening. She opened the journal. It was full of writing, Eleanor's writing. But what stood out to Claire were the last few pages. They were hastily scribbled, as if someone had written them in a panic. "I hear them now. The whispers. They are getting louder and I can't escape them. Isabella is calling to me from the walls, but I can't find her. I've searched the house and every room feels the same. The walls are closing in, and I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Please, someone, help me." Claire's heart sank as she read the words. It was clear now. Eleanor had been driven mad by the whispers, just like she was. The house had consumed her, just as it seemed to be consuming Claire now. But there was one more line, written in a shaky hand, that caught her attention. "The walls are alive." Claire's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The words she had just read echoed in her mind like a constant hum, a reminder of the madness that had once gripped Eleanor. "The walls are alive." That phrase kept repeating, growing louder with every heartbeat. She didn't want to believe it, but everything in this house, every strange noise, every shadow, was pushing her toward the terrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The whispers that had been so faint and distant now felt like they were pressing in on her, suffocating her thoughts. She could almost feel the walls around her pulse, like they were breathing, alive in their own right. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. She had to keep going. She had to know more. The house was silent now, but the air felt thick with tension. The weight of the past, of all the pain and loss that had happened here, hung over her like a heavy cloak. But Claire wasn't going to leave. Not yet. She had come this far, and she needed to understand the truth, no matter what it cost. With the journal still in her hand, she stood up and moved toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, something caught her eye. The floor beneath her feet creaked, and she paused, looking down. The floorboards in front of her had shifted slightly, leaving a small gap. There was something underneath, Claire's heart raced as she knelt down, her fingers brushing against the crack. She pulled at the floorboard, and it gave way with a soft groan. She looked down into the small space and gasped. There, buried beneath the floor, was another letter. The envelope was old and yellowed, the edges worn and torn from years of neglect. Claire's fingers trembled as she pulled it out, her mind racing with questions. Who had left it here? What was it trying to tell her? She carefully opened the letter, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The ink was smudged in places, but the words were clear enough. To anyone who finds this letter, I am sorry. I cannot undo the horrors we've brought upon this place. I can feel the house growing stronger, feeding off our fear. It's calling to us, pulling us deeper into its grip. The walls are alive, and they are not forgiving. You must leave before it's too late. I've tried to escape, but it won't let me go. The whispers are everywhere. They won't stop until they have you too. The letter ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted, or worse, silenced. Claire's stomach twisted with dread. Whoever had written this letter had known the truth. The house was alive, and it was hungry. She stood up quickly, her legs unsteady. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder, thicker. The whispers were back, louder now, crawling into her mind like a swarm of insects. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel their presence, like hands reaching out from every corner of the room. The house was not just haunted. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was feeding on their fear. Claire's breath quickened, her thoughts racing. She needed to find a way to escape, but she had no idea how. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, each hallway twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every room led to another, and every time she thought she had found a way out, she ended up back where she started. Her mind was clouded with panic, but she pushed it down, focusing on the one thing that kept her grounded. The house had a history, and she had to uncover it. Only then would she understand how to break free. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging her to listen. They were everywhere now, echoing off the walls, crawling into her ears. She stumbled back into the hallway, clutching the journal and the letter tightly in her hands. She had to keep moving. As she walked, the house seemed to shift around her. The walls closed in, the floors groaned beneath her feet. Every room she passed seemed familiar, yet different, as if the house itself was shifting, rearranging its rooms to trap her inside. She couldn't escape. Not yet. There was something more here, something hidden deep within the house's walls. Claire's mind kept drifting back to the old photograph she had found earlier, the one of Isabella and her mother. Was it possible that Eleanor and her daughter had uncovered the house's secret before they lost their sanity? She turned a corner, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of escape. That's when she saw it. A door. It was tucked away at the far end of the hallway, almost hidden by the thick shadows that filled the space. The door looked old, weathered, as if it had been forgotten for years. But something about it felt different. It didn't belong here, not in this house, not with all the others. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. This door, hidden away like a secret, was the answer. She had to open it. She rushed toward it, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. But what caught Claire's attention was what was in the center of the room. A large, cracked mirror stood against the far wall, its surface reflecting only darkness. The glass was murky, distorted, but Claire could still see something in the reflection. A figure. At first, she thought it was her own reflection, but as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't. It was a shadow, a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes, staring back at her. The figure seemed to move, shifting slightly in the mirror, though Claire knew she wasn't moving. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was not just a reflection. It was real. It was in the mirror, watching her, waiting. "Find me. I am waiting." The whisper came again, louder now, as though it was coming from the mirror itself. Claire took a step back, her heart racing. She couldn't look away, the figure's eyes drawing her in, pulling her closer to the mirror. She felt as though the walls around her were closing in, the whispers growing louder and more insistent until they filled her mind. The mirror. It was the key. Claire couldn't take her eyes off the mirror. The figure in the reflection, the one with the hollow eyes, seemed to move closer, drawing her in. She felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine, her heart racing as the whispers swirled around her like a storm. "Find me. I am waiting." The voice was soft, almost like a plea, but there was something more sinister underneath. The figure in the mirror seemed to smile, but it was the kind of smile that made her stomach twist with dread. Claire knew she had to look away, but her body wouldn't obey. The air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the very essence of the house was pulling her deeper into its grip. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, closing around her like a vice. The whispers were deafening now, filling her head, drowning out everything else. She had to get away from the mirror. She had to escape before it took her, too. But as she turned to leave, the room seemed to shift. The door that had been right behind her was now further away, as though the house itself was rearranging itself. The walls stretched out, and the hallway she had just walked down seemed endless, a maze she couldn't escape. The mirror's whisper called to her again, and she couldn't help but look back. The figure was still there, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. But now it was clearer, more defined. It was not just a shadow. It was a person, someone who had been trapped in the mirror for a long, long time. "Help me," the figure whispered. "You have to help me." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Who was this person? And why did she feel like they were speaking directly to her? Without thinking, Claire stepped closer to the mirror. The whispers in the room seemed to quiet for a moment, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered just inches from the cold glass. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface, a surge of energy shot through her. The mirror felt alive, pulsing with a strange power. The figure in the reflection flinched, and for the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw something, someone, standing behind her in the dark corner of the room. But when she turned, there was nothing there, just darkness. Her pulse quickened. What was happening? Was it the house? Or was it something worse? As her hand pulled away from the mirror, the whispers returned, louder now, almost frantic. The walls trembled, and the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something powerful. It was like the house was alive, and it was growing restless. Claire backed away from the mirror, her feet stumbling as she tried to keep her balance. The whispers were growing louder again, swirling around her, making it harder to think. She felt like she was suffocating, drowning in the sound of them. But then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house fell silent. Claire stood frozen, her eyes darting around the room. Was it over? Had she imagined it all? No, she could still feel it. The presence, the weight of something watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She wasn't alone. The house had been silent for far too long. It had been waiting for her to find the truth. Claire's mind raced as she tried to process everything. The mirror, the whispers, the figure. She couldn't just leave now. She had to understand what it all meant. The house had been hiding its secrets for far too long, and she was the one it had chosen to uncover them. With a deep breath, Claire forced herself to turn back to the mirror. The figure was still there, staring at her, its hollow eyes pleading. It was as if it knew what she was thinking. It was calling her closer. But this time, Claire wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. The figure didn't speak at first, but its lips moved, forming words that Claire couldn't hear. She leaned in closer, her breath fogging up the glass. But as she got closer, the words became clearer. "Help me. I've been trapped here. It's been so long. You have to help me." Claire felt a cold chill wrap around her, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. There was something about the figure that seemed so desperate, so lost. She needed to know more. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's eyes widened, and its mouth moved again, the words slow and deliberate. "They trapped me here. They put me in this mirror. They wouldn't let me leave. They are watching, always watching. You have to break the curse." The air in the room grew heavy again, the walls closing in as the whispers grew louder. Claire felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She didn't know who they were, but she had an awful feeling that she was running out of time. Suddenly, the figure's face twisted in pain, and it let out a silent scream. The glass of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment, Claire saw something, someone, reaching out from behind the reflection. "Get out!" the figure screamed, its voice now echoing in her mind. Claire recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was trapped in this mirror was not just a reflection. It was something far darker, something far more dangerous. Before she could move, the house itself seemed to groan, like it was alive and in pain. The walls trembled again, and the temperature dropped even further. The mirror began to crack, the glass splitting down the middle, sending shards of broken glass falling to the floor. Claire stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She had to leave before whatever was trapped in that mirror found a way out. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice. It was the same voice, but this time it wasn't coming from the mirror. "You can't escape. Not anymore." The walls seemed to close in on her, and the floor beneath her feet groaned. She had to get out. She had to, before the house claimed her too. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as the whisper echoed through the room. "You can't escape. Not anymore." Her pulse raced, and the air around her felt thick, heavy, as though the house was closing in on her, trapping her within its walls. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. She had to leave, but the hallway seemed endless. She turned toward the door, her breath shallow, and tried to move, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. A low groan rumbled from deep within the walls, vibrating through the floor beneath her. It wasn't just the house settling. It was something much worse. The floorboards creaked as though they were alive, shifting beneath her. A shiver ran up her spine. The house had changed. It was awake now, aware of her presence. "Get out, before it's too late," the voice from the mirror whispered again, this time more frantic. Claire's mind was spinning. She couldn't think straight. She had to find a way out, before the house took her too. The walls seemed to shift and groan with a terrible force. It was like the house itself was alive, its very foundation alive with something dark and hungry. Claire backed away from the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The temperature in the room had dropped even further. She could see her breath now, forming clouds in the freezing air. She took a step forward, but something stopped her. The mirror, the one she had just turned away from, rippled again, its surface warping like water. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself was bending around the reflection. Claire hesitated, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. And then, as if on cue, the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "I'm here. Find me." She turned back toward the mirror, her body trembling with fear. The figure was there again, its hollow eyes staring at her, its face twisted in anguish. This time, it wasn't just trapped behind the glass. The figure seemed to be reaching toward her, its fingers stretching out from the reflection, as if it was trying to pull itself free. Claire's body froze in place, her heart racing. The house was feeding off her fear. She realized. It had been waiting for her. The whispers, the figure, the way the walls seemed to move. It was all part of the house's dark power. She wasn't just trapped in the house. The house was inside her, feeding off her every fear and doubt. The figure in the mirror let out a soft cry, and Claire stepped forward, as though her body had lost all control. Her fingers reached for the glass, her mind a blur of confusion and terror. "Help me. Please," the figure whispered again. It was a voice filled with pain, filled with an emptiness that made Claire's skin crawl. The figure's eyes seemed to follow her every movement, its gaze so intense it felt as though it could see into her very soul. Claire knew she should turn away. She knew she should run. But the figure's gaze held her, frozen. It was as though the house was pulling her in, wrapping its tendrils around her, dragging her closer to the edge. The walls groaned again, louder this time, shaking with a force that seemed to come from deep within the house. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been. Claire's breath came out in sharp, visible puffs, each one a reminder of how much time she had left before the house took her. She had to get out. She had to break free. But as her hand touched the cold glass, something happened. The house trembled, and the floor beneath her feet cracked. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the whispers grew into a cacophony, filling her mind with screams and cries for help. And then it happened. The figure in the mirror stretched out, its hands reaching through the glass, its body warping, distorting. Claire screamed as the figure's hand touched hers, cold and clammy, sending a shock of terror through her body. You can help me." The voice was no longer pleading. It was demanding, commanding. The glass shattered with a loud, cracking sound, shards of glass falling to the floor in a shower of sharp, jagged edges. Claire's heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped out of the mirror, its body fully formed now, standing before her. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a person, a woman, with hollow eyes and a face twisted in pain. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes hung loosely from her frail frame. She reached out with long, bony fingers, and Claire recoiled, but she couldn't move. "Help me. You have to help me." Claire's mind screamed in terror, but her body refused to obey. The house was holding her in place, the walls closing in, pressing her back toward the mirror, toward the figure. The temperature continued to plummet, and Claire could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers were louder now, 1,000 voices echoing in her head, each one demanding her attention. The figure moved closer, her eyes locked onto Claire's with an intensity that sent waves of dread washing over her. "It's too late for you now," the figure whispered, her voice low and menacing. "You've already been chosen." The house trembled again, its walls creaking and groaning as though they were alive. Claire could feel it now, the power of the house pressing down on her, trying to crush her, trying to take her into its dark embrace. With one final, desperate effort, Claire broke free from the house's grip. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor as she made her way toward the door. The figure's voice followed her, growing fainter but still echoing in her ears. "You can't escape. Not anymore." But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to get out before the house claimed her soul, too. Claire's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she ran down the hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing like thunder in the silence. She didn't dare look back. The figure from the mirror was still behind her, its cold fingers reaching for her, pulling at the very fabric of her reality. "You can't escape." The voice was getting louder now, its tone filled with malice and hunger. The house seemed to be alive, its walls closing in around her, the air thick with the scent of decay. She could feel its presence, pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her heart was racing, her chest tightening with every step. The door was just ahead. She could see it now, a faint sliver of light shining through the cracks. She was so close. But then, just as her hand reached for the handle, the house gave a violent lurch. The ground beneath her feet shook, sending her crashing to the floor. Claire screamed, the pain in her wrist sharp and immediate, but she didn't have time to worry about it. She had to get up. She had to get out. The whispers grew louder, no longer just voices. Now they were screams, shouts of agony, begging for release. They came from every direction, from every corner of the house. She could hear them in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air around her. With trembling hands, Claire pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain in her wrist. She stumbled toward the door again, but the house was fighting back. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, becoming like living things, reaching for her, trying to drag her back into the darkness. "Help me," the voice from the mirror cried again, now full of desperation. "You can't leave me here." Claire's head was spinning. The house had taken so much already. It had consumed so many souls, and now it wanted hers too. The figure, her twisted reflection, was getting closer. Her pale hands now fully formed, reaching through the walls, trying to grab hold of Claire's arm. "No, let go." Claire screamed, struggling to break free from the figure's grip. The house shuddered violently, and for a moment, everything went still. A deafening silence filled the room, pressing down on Claire like a weight. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, her mind racing. And then, just as quickly as it had stopped, the house groaned again. The whispering returned, louder than before. The walls shook, their cold breath on her skin as they inched closer. She could hear it. The house was alive, feeding off her fear. Her eyes darted to the door, and Claire knew, deep down, that it was her only way out. She had to get through that door. She had to leave the house before it consumed her like it had consumed so many others. With a final burst of strength, Claire lunged for the door handle and yanked it open. The door groaned in protest, but it gave way, and the cold night air rushed in, filling her lungs with a desperate relief. She didn't stop to look back. She didn't dare. She just ran. Her feet pounded against the gravel driveway, the house looming behind her like a dark, hungry monster. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes, but she kept going, her body on autopilot. She didn't care where she was going, as long as it was away from that cursed house. But then, just as she thought she was free, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The earth trembled, and Claire's body lurched forward, sending her crashing to the ground. She gasped for breath, her body aching, but before she could gather herself, she felt it. The presence of the house, still there, still pulling at her. The whispers came again, only this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from within her mind. "You can't escape. You're ours now." Claire's eyes widened in terror as she tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. The ground around her seemed to pulse, as if the house's very foundation was alive, dragging her back toward it. Her heart raced in her chest as the whispers grew louder. She could feel it now. The house was inside her. It had followed her, feeding off her fear, claiming her as its own. There was no escape. "You belong to me," the voice echoed, louder than ever before. Claire closed her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't fight anymore. She had tried. She had fought so hard to escape, but it was too late. The ground beneath her began to tremble once more, and Claire could feel the house's cold breath against her neck. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed her whole.